On April 2, 2026, the U.S. invoked national security authorities to issue the Liberation Day order. The new directive mandated a 100% tariff on patented pharmaceutical imports from countries lacking a reshoring or pricing agreement. Indian pharmaceutical indices experienced a sharp, immediate sell-off, but the panic was short-lived. Within days, the broad sector recovered completely. Investors quickly ran the numbers. Between 85% and 90% of India's $10 billion in pharmaceutical exports to the United States consist of generic drugs. The executive order contained an explicit loophole, keeping those specific exports untouched. That single line of text created a deeply flawed sense of security for the nation celebrated as the pharmacy of the world. Beneath the headlines, the U.S. trade regime actively dismantles the structural viability of Indian medicine manufacturing. The sector actually faces an existential threat advancing from two distinct, widely overlooked angles. The first is a set of hidden financial mechanics, indirect tariffs that silently but mathematically compress operational margins on those exact exempted generic drugs. And the second is a profound geopolitical vulnerability located at the very beginning of India's raw material supply chain. Together, these forces create a margin vice, a structural trap squeezing Indian manufacturers from both the demand side and the supply side simultaneously. Surviving the next decade requires looking past the temporary safe harbor of tariff exemptions to understand the true interconnected vulnerabilities of global medicine production. To escape relentless generic market price erosion, top-tier Indian firms spent the last decade pivoting. They poured capital into high-margin specialty therapies, branded formulations, and complex delivery systems. An Indian multinational at a 31.9% EBITDA margin cannot absorb a 100% increase in cost of goods sold. When the tariff is applied, the margin collapses into negative territory. The product becomes uncompetitive against U.S. domestic alternatives, severing the company's highest growth revenue streams. The immediate danger lies in the regulatory classification of new, sophisticated therapies. Items like liposomal formulations, specialized inhalation products, and peptide drugs are classified as complex generics. They are incredibly difficult to reverse engineer and do not follow standard bioequivalence pathways. Trade analysts warn that if the U.S. Commerce Department broadens its enforcement scope to classify complex generics under the patented umbrella, it instantly penalizes billions of dollars in Indian R&D investment. Simple, low-margin generics remain safe for now. The ambiguous regulatory edges of U.S. trade policy directly threaten the specific, high-value innovations Indian firms require to survive. The U.S. administration did provide a coercive escape hatch. Foreign companies can secure a 0% tariff tier by committing to a shovel-in-the-ground approach and actively building domestic manufacturing facilities in America. For Indian exporters, executing this reshoring mandate is mathematically impossible due to deep structural cost arbitrage. This side-by-side comparison shows the extreme capital expenditure gap. Costs for strict facility qualification and analytical development are up to 80% lower in India than the United States. Operational expenditure divides further. Personnel costs for complex API development are nearly 64% lower on the subcontinent. Indian pharmaceutical companies operate on aggregate EBITDA margins between 20% and 32%. Forcing these companies to absorb the multi-billion-dollar capex required to build greenfield U.S. plants severely degrades shareholder value and destroys the return on capital employed. For Indian pharmaceutical giants, committing to massive U.S. construction isn't a pathway to compliance. It is guaranteed capital destruction. The most devastating threat to the generic model arrives indirectly. Concurrently with the pharmaceutical orders, the U.S. overhauled Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, and copper. The revised framework established a punitive derivative rule. Any imported product containing more than 15% metal by weight is hit with a 25% tariff applied to its entire import value. This policy inadvertently strikes the pharmaceutical supply chain. Essential primary packaging, specifically cold-formed aluminum blister foils, is highly exposed to this threshold. Because sterile seals, crimps, and blister pods easily breach 15% aluminum by weight, global packaging input costs surged as supply chains rerouted. The metal tariffs also hit the capital equipment required for facility modernization. Modernizing legacy plants to meet stricter U.S. regulatory standards requires importing expensive, GMP-compliant stainless steel reactors and continuous processing centrifuges. These escalating input costs fall hardest on the foundation of the industry, the thousands of highly fragmented Tier 3 manufacturers producing massive volumes of unbranded generics. These generic manufacturers are trapped by U.S. buyers. Powerful pharmacy benefit managers and wholesaler consortiums have heavily consolidated their purchasing power in America, and these consortiums enforce strict price ceilings. Indian generic makers operate on razor-thin margins and are contractually unable to pass escalating packaging and machinery tariffs onto U.S. consumers. By artificially inflating the physical costs of packaging and machinery while U.S. buyers cap the final sale price, the fundamental profit margin of a generic drug is crushed from the inside out. All of this trade friction assumes India actually controls the drugs it exports. India formulates 20% of the world's generic drug volume, but relies heavily on China for 70 to 80% of its foundational raw materials. These materials include key starting materials and active pharmaceutical ingredients, the core chemical components required to produce life-saving antibiotics, vitamins, and fermentation-based elements. India's fragmented final formulation capacity is entirely bottlenecked by China's chemical synthesis operations, which benefit from massive economies of scale and state-subsidized energy. During periods of supply chain disruption or geopolitical tension, this near monopoly grants Chinese suppliers unilateral, weaponizable pricing power over the global market. When a critical Chinese API's cost rises by 25%, an Indian manufacturer's cost of goods sold directly spikes by 10 to 15%. The Indian business model is trapped. Unpredictable Chinese inflation drives costs up, while U.S. trade policy pushes revenue down. This two-front geopolitical squeeze renders the title Pharmacy of the World dangerously hollow as long as India lacks true chemical supply chain sovereignty. Surviving this multi-front trade war requires the rapid, flawless execution of the Indian government's production-linked incentive schemes. Tracking this global supply map, the scheme established domestic manufacturing capacity of 56,800 metric tons by 2025, breaking the Chinese monopoly on bulk drugs. Simultaneously, corporate India deliberately diversified, reducing North American reliance by expanding exports to Latin America, Africa, and the CIS region. The strategy is to operate as the premier healthcare provider for the Global South, building a massive financial firewall against unilateral U.S. trade actions. Finally, the industry must transition away from reverse engineering simple formulations. Companies are now routing significant capital into complex biosimilars, biologics, and novel biological innovation. The sector projects growth to a $130 billion valuation by 2030. Reaching that number depends entirely on executing three pillars. Number 1, API sovereignty. Number 2, global geographic diversification. And number 3, complex R&D. The historical era of relying purely on labor and cost arbitrage to produce low-margin bulk generics is permanently over. If India successfully navigates this geopolitical margin vice, it will evolve from a fragile, low-cost factory into an indispensable, sovereign hub of global biopharmaceutical innovation.